May 30, 1944, a humid dawn at Fort McClellan, Alabama. From the freight cars stepped weary German prisoners, bracing for hatred, for punishment, yet at the gates they met white uniforms, not rifles. The air carried disinfectant and coffee, a strange comfort after years of war, and down the corridor the rattle of trolleys mixed with a soft German phrase from an American nurse. Men taught to see monsters instead found broth, bandages, and kindness from the very people they were told would despise them. It was a paradox too sharp to ignore. Barbed wire outside, mercy inside. This was no propaganda. It was real, and it would change them forever. Stay with us, subscribe and support the channel, because this is the story the Reich never wanted its soldiers to tell. The freight cars groaned open under the Alabama sun, iron doors sliding on rails that still smelled of coal smoke and dust from the long southern haul. Outspilled men who had once worn the grey-green of the Wehrmacht, now draped in fatigue and disbelief. Some carried bandaged limbs, others clutched a single duffel bag or nothing at all. They expected a barren yard, barking guards, maybe the blows of rifle butts. What they found instead was an organized reception, medical tents lined neatly beside a Red Cross flag, nurses in pressed white uniforms standing at attention with clipboards, and the faint aroma of boiled coffee wafting over the rail yard. Nearly 380,000 German prisoners of war would be shipped to the United States during the conflict, an astonishing number, nearly a tenth of all POWs captured by the Allies. Their arrival was less a trickle than a flood, carried across the Atlantic by Liberty ships, then shunted by train into inland camps. Fort McClellan, like dozens of others, had sprung up with geometric precision, barbed wire stretched over red clay soil, wooden barracks in rows, a parade ground, a hospital ward, a chapel. It was a world within a world, part prison and part small American town. For the new arrivals, the paradox struck immediately. One German lieutenant later wrote, "We had been told America would humiliate us, work us like slaves. Instead, the first person I spoke to was a nurse who asked if I was thirsty." His voice carried the incredulity of thousands. They had marched across villages where civilians spat at them, yet here, across an ocean, a stranger in uniform handed them water. The sensory world of these first days lingered in memory. The smell of disinfectant in the intake wards, the metallic clang of stretchers sliding onto frames, the warmth of sunlight pouring through screened windows, so different from the damp European winter they had left behind. Some men whispered prayers. Others muttered that it was all theatre, some propaganda play staged to weaken them. But the broth was hot, the bandages clean, the beds surprisingly soft. Whatever doubts they carried, their bodies could not deny relief. Logistics framed every moment. The US Army Service Forces calculated everything down to the calorie and the cot. Each camp was designed to hold anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 prisoners, with separate infirmaries for the sick and wounded. Trains arrived weekly, sometimes unloading 800 men in a single morning. Nurses and orderlies catalogued injuries, recording fevers, dysentery cases, trench foot, even lice infestations. A nurse named Helen, writing in her stateside diary in 1943, captured the strange sight. They looked like scarecrows in uniform, yet many were barely older than my youngest brother, some so grateful for a blanket, others glaring as if we had insulted their pride simply by helping them. And then there was the food. Soldiers recalled the first meal, stew thick with beef, white bread, butter and coffee with sugar. To men who had lived on turnips and thin soup through the final winter campaigns in Tunisia or Italy, it was a surreal banquet. One prisoner later admitted, "We thought it was a trick. We looked at each other afraid to eat, but when the guards ate the same, we knew it was true." The contradiction deepened as guards and nurses treated them not as subhuman enemies, but as patients and guests of the Geneva Convention. Army medical bulletins stressed that POWs were to be given the same rations as American troops, the same medical care, the same basic dignity. For many of the Germans who had seen Allied prisoners treated with indifference or worse under the Reich, the irony cut deep. Every clang of the mess hall tray, every whiff of strong soap in the barracks, every kind smile from a nurse chipped away at the enemy image they had been taught. This wasn't set propaganda. One sergeant scribbled in a letter later smuggled back to Bavaria. This was real life. Still, suspicion lingered. Some men muttered that it was bait, that eventually the kindness would dissolve into labor camps and beatings. Others clung fiercely to ideology, refusing to speak a word of English, keeping to themselves in rigid formations even in the yard. The paradox was not complete acceptance, but unease, a fracture in certainty. And so the stage was set. From the moment of arrival, the prisoners' world had turned upside down. America, which they had been told was brutal and barbaric, greeted them with structure, order, and even kindness. The barbed wire was real, the guard towers loomed, but the people within the wire extended hands of help. What the Germans did not yet know was that this first encounter was only the beginning. Beyond the gates and into the infirmaries, the quiet power of American nurses would unravel their expectations further, transforming not just wounds and fevers, but the very idea of who their enemy truly was. The POWs quickly learned that the camp hospital was not a place of weakness but of power, and that its guardians were not armed sentries but women in white. The American nurses who moved briskly through the wards embodied a quiet authority, one that defied both German expectations and even some American assumptions about gender in wartime. By 1944, nearly 60,000 Army Nurse Corps members were in uniform, serving from field hospitals in North Africa to psychiatric wards in Kansas. They had trained under the unforgiving regimen of Army manuals, emergency surgery prep, triage under bombardment, malaria prevention, even the delicate skill of coaxing feverish soldiers back from delirium. Many were in their early 20s. Some had never left their hometowns before the war, yet here they found themselves caring for men who only months earlier had tried to kill their countrymen. For the German prisoners, raised in a culture where women were rarely seen in command, the shock was immediate. A corporal remembered, "We expected the women to be secretaries or cooks. Instead, they gave us orders." The men saluted the guards, but it was the nurses who commanded the room. In German military culture, medicine was a male preserve. Here in Alabama or Texas or Minnesota, women in pressed white caps charted temperatures, administered morphine and ordered stretcher teams with clipped authority. The daily rhythms of the ward reinforced this paradox. At dawn came the clang of enamel basins, the sharp scent of iodine and carbolic soap, the steady shuffle of nurses' shoes down the linoleum halls. Breakfast trays clattered in oatmeal, eggs, milk, and nurses dictated who was strong enough to eat solids and who required broth. Their handwriting filled endless ledgers, pulse rates, blood pressure, wound dressings. Orderlies obeyed without question. Guards, rifles slung, deferred to their judgment. It was not merely professional skill that unsettled the POWs, but the way authority was coupled with humanity. A nurse named Margaret, stationed in Texas, later recalled in an oral history, "They were young boys, really. Some with terrible burns, some shaking with malaria. We didn't think of them as Nazis lying in those beds. We thought of them as patients. My duty was the same whether they wore khaki or field grey." Her matter-of-fact tone belied the revolutionary effect this had on the men under her care. Numbers tell part of the story. Between 1943 and 1946, over 425 Army hospitals treated POWs on American soil, staffed by thousands of nurses. At Camp Swift, Texas alone, more than 1,200 Germans passed through the infirmary in a single year, cared for by fewer than 24 women. The scale was staggering, and yet each case was handled with the same insistence on dignity. Some prisoners reacted with suspicion, muttering that such kindness was a form of interrogation, a mask hiding ulterior motives. Others were undone by it. One diary, later found in a Bavarian attic, records the confession. "The woman who bandaged my arm looked at me as if I were human. I could not meet her eyes. How can the enemy show such mercy?" The sensory clash was everywhere. A nurse's soft voice cutting through the clamour of a crowded ward. The scent of perfume mingling faintly with disinfectant. The cool touch of a thermometer pressed under the tongue, when just weeks before the same men had clutched rifles in burning deserts or frozen fields. It was dissonance made flesh. Even among Americans, the nurse's authority was sometimes underestimated. A camp officer in Louisiana complained in a letter that the nurses appear too gentle for the hardened enemy. Yet statistics proved otherwise. Recovery rates in POW wards equaled or exceeded those of American troops. Efficiency, compassion and discipline, qualities dismissed as feminine weakness, became weapons of their own. And there was something else, the subtle reshaping of power dynamics. In Nazi ideology, women were relegated to Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. In an American ward, however, a German officer could not refuse a nurse's order to roll up his sleeve for an injection. Defiance meant punishment, but more often it meant ridicule by one's peers for flinching before a woman. Authority wore a white cap and carried a stethoscope. and the prisoners had no defense against it. One German sergeant, once steeped in Nazi rhetoric, later admitted, "It was not the barbed wire that broke us. It was the women. They treated us without hate, and we could not understand it. It was the first crack in the wall." This paradox, that mercy could be as destabilizing as force, would only deepen as the prisoners confronted America's medical ethics, where even their most broken comrades received care equal to that of the very men who had defeated them. But that story began in the operating rooms and sick bays, where the stakes were higher than dignity, life, death, and the question of whether an enemy deserved to be saved at all. In the fluorescent glow of camp hospitals, war's brutality met a different kind of battlefield, one fought with scalpels, gauze, and the steady pulse of human conscience. German POWs arrived not only with bruised pride but with festering wounds, malaria from North Africa, frostbite from the Russian front, or shrapnel buried deep in muscle. For American medical staff, the paradox was stark: to save the lives of men who had taken lives from their own brothers, husbands, and sons. The Geneva Convention of 1929 left no ambiguity. Prisoners of war were entitled to the same medical treatment as American soldiers. Army Medical Department bulletins drilled this principle relentlessly. There shall be no distinction of treatment based on race, rank, or nationality. That order was tested daily in crowded infirmaries, where a wounded German might lie in the next bed to a wounded American, both waiting for the same surgeon's hands. The numbers alone told a story of scale. By 1945, nearly 45,000 German POWs required hospitalization at some point during captivity in the US. More than 2,000 underwent major surgeries, amputations, abdominal repairs, complex fracture resets. Statistics showed that recovery rates for prisoners averaged over 90%, rivaling those of American GIs. In some wards, prisoners received penicillin before it was even widely available to civilians, a fact that astonished men who had been taught to see the United States as a land of crude excess. For the Germans, the sensory experience of the hospital was surreal: the antiseptic sting of iodine, the hum of ceiling fans cutting through humid southern nights, the muffled groans from operating rooms, where ether sweetened the air with its sickly sweet odor. In this atmosphere, mercy was tangible, almost overwhelming. A nurse named Ruth, stationed at Camp Atterbury in Indiana, wrote in a letter, "It is the strangest thing to steady the hand of a man whose country is killing ours. But when he looks at you with fear, you cannot see an enemy, you see only a patient." That act of seeing, repeated thousands of times across the camps, became its own quiet defiance against hatred. The Germans noticed. A corporal recalled his astonishment when a doctor spent 2 hours extracting shrapnel from his thigh. "He worked as if I were his own comrade. I could not imagine our doctors doing the same for Americans." Another wrote that an American nurse scolded me like a mother for not resting enough. "She treated me better than the sergeant who commanded me." And yet, the paradox cut both ways. Some nurses confessed to private moments of doubt. Was it right to devote scarce penicillin to a prisoner while civilians in town still went without? Was it treason to feel pity for men who had marched under Hitler's banner? One army surgeon later admitted in memoirs, "Every stitch carried a question, but if we betrayed our own code, then what separated us from them?" That code was not universal. There were moments of tension: an orderly who muttered slurs while cleaning a wound, a guard who mocked the prisoners for their weakness. Some Germans recoiled at being tended by women, refusing touch or snapping insults that echoed Nazi disdain. But over time, necessity overcame ideology. Fever does not yield to dogma, nor does infection respect pride. When morphine dulled pain, or a clean bandage replaced a blood-soaked rag, even the most hardened soldier felt the undeniable weight of care. There were darker moments too. In psychiatric wards, German prisoners suffering from what we now call PTSD shook and screamed through the night. American staff recorded nightmares of Stalingrad, of Allied bombings, of executions they had witnessed or committed. A nurse remembered. "They cried out in German words I didn't know, but the terror was clear. Sometimes we sat with them until it passed. War had broken them no matter whose side they were on." Such scenes blurred the line between victor and vanquished. War had reduced them all to fragile bodies in need of healing. For many Germans, this was the deepest paradox. The enemy saved them when their own Reich had abandoned them to hunger and exhaustion. The legacy of those nights was not only physical recovery, but ideological fracture. Some POWs left the hospital wards whispering doubts, unable to reconcile Nazi propaganda with what they had experienced. One diary fragment captured the turning point. If America is barbaric, then why did they save my life? Perhaps everything we were told is lies. But the paradox did not end at the hospital door. Beyond medicine lay another daily ritual that reinforced America's strange abundance: food, and in the mess halls, over steaming plates of meat and bread, the Germans would discover yet another crack in the image they had been taught to believe. At midday in the POW camps, the clang of the mess hall bell carried across the yards like a summons from another world. Prisoners filed in under the watch of guards, boots scuffing on gravel, the air thick with the mingled smells of boiled coffee, roasted meat and baking bread. For men who had grown used to half-rotten turnips and watery cabbage soup on the European fronts, the abundance of American rations felt less like sustenance and more like a paradoxical dream. The numbers were undeniable. By US Army regulation, German prisoners were entitled to the same daily rations as American soldiers, 3,500 calories per day. In practice, this meant eggs, milk, beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread with butter and fruit when available. Even coffee rationed at home for civilians was served to POWs, sometimes with sugar and cream. A statistic that circulated among astonished prisoners compared American generosity to their homeland. In 1944, the average German civilian subsisted on just 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day. Some POWs consumed nearly triple that behind American fences. The first taste was often disbelief, one former Luftwaffe mechanic later recalled. We thought it was poisoned. How could the enemy give us meat? At home, my mother wrote that she queued 4 hours for a loaf of bread, and here steak. Another diary entry, smuggled in a coat lining back to Bavaria, declared, "We are eating like kings in captivity while our families starve. Nothing makes sense." The sensory richness of these meals made the contrast even sharper. The buttery sheen of mashed potatoes steaming on metal trays, the tang of ketchup, an American novelty spooned over meatloaf, the sweet shock of ice cream, cold on the tongue even in the humid southern heat. Many Germans had never tasted such things in peacetime, let alone during war. Nurses often played a role here too, checking patients' trays, coaxing the sick to sip broth, sneaking an extra cookie into the pocket of a man recovering from fever. One nurse, Dorothy from Kansas, admitted in a letter, "It felt like treason to give so much sugar to men in grey, but when they smiled like boys, I remembered my own brothers overseas and thought, perhaps kindness is also a weapon." Not all responded with gratitude. Some hardened Nazis mocked the meals as a decadent trick, a ploy to fatten prisoners for labor. They muttered that true Germans should refuse such softness, but hunger is a stubborn adversary. Even the most defiant eventually gave in, chewing slowly, savoring the strange sweetness of cornbread or the rich aroma of bacon at breakfast. The irony deepened when prisoners compared notes from home. Letters from Bavaria, Saxony or the Ruhr described hunger winters, bombed bakeries, black markets, where a few eggs cost a week's wages. And here, across an ocean, the enemy piled their plates high. A sergeant confessed years later, "It was in the dining hall, not the hospital, that I first doubted everything Goebbels had said. We were told Americans were starving, yet even their prisoners ate better than our children." Statistics reinforced the impression. America's agricultural output in 1944 reached record highs, over 127 million tons of grain, 23 billion pounds of beef, and enough dairy to flood military kitchens worldwide. German POWs saw this abundance not in charts but in servings, day after day. They measured American industrial might in spoonfuls, not speeches. And yet, abundance had side effects. Some prisoners gained weight rapidly, a strange humiliation for men raised on Spartan ideals. Others hoarded food under mattresses, unable to believe the next meal would also be plentiful. A nurse wrote of a fevered soldier who wept openly over a slice of white bread. He said it was softer than anything his mother had ever baked. He kissed it before eating. Meals became a theatre of paradox. Behind barbed wire, the enemy sat at long tables, eating more richly than the families they left behind. They whispered in disbelief, laughed with mouths full, or sat silently staring at trays, undone by generosity. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality. And it forced the Germans to grapple with a question their ideology had never prepared them for: how could an enemy so vilified feed them with such plenty? But sustenance was not only physical. Alongside bread and meat came something equally potent: letters, words, hymns, and fleeting moments of human contact that carried power no ration chart could measure. In the quiet hours of the camp, after the clang of trays and the hum of daily drills, another paradox unfolded, this one softer, subtler. Words, music, and the fragile thread of human connection crossed the barbed wire in ways that rifles never could. For many German prisoners, the greatest shock was not the abundance of food or the precision of American logistics, but the sound of their own language spoken back to them, not with hostility, but with care. Some nurses had studied German in school, others picked up phrases on the ward, schlafen Sie for sleep now, Ruhing for calm. It startled men used to hearing their tongue barked in commands. A nurse's broken German, awkward but earnest, landed with the force of a revelation. A diary from a Bavarian conscript at Camp Shelby recorded, "The nurse said in my own tongue, 'Sie du bist sicher jetzt, Sie du are safe now.' I had not felt safe in years. I nearly cried." Letters deepened the paradox. Under strict rules, prisoners were allowed to write 2 letters and 4 postcards each month, limited to 24 lines each. The US Army censored every word, yet even within those boundaries, lifelines stretched across oceans. Prisoners scrawled about camp life, described food, and often confessed confusion. "We are treated well, too well. Do not believe what the papers say." For German families digging potatoes from frozen ground, such testimonies carried unimaginable weight. Nurses sometimes served as translators, helping prisoners navigate Red Cross forms or decipher English instructions. A woman in Texas recalled, "One boy brought me his letter weeping because he could not write in English as required for the envelope. I filled it in for him. His gratitude was so fierce it embarrassed me. That small act, a few strokes of a pen, bridged an empire of ideology." Music carried its own mercy. Prisoners formed choirs, singing hymns and folk songs in the evenings. The sound drifted across the camp, haunting, beautiful, unsettling. American staff often paused to listen. One nurse described standing at the infirmary window while Germans sang Stille Nacht on Christmas Eve, their voices mingling with the faint strains of Bing Crosby playing on a guard's radio. For a moment, the war seemed suspended in harmony. The sensory weight of these exchanges lingered. The scratch of pen on cheap camp paper, the faint scent of ink, the timbre of a hymn echoing against wooden barracks walls. A nurse's warm hand guiding a patient's trembling fingers as he tried to write Liebe Mutter. These were not grand gestures, but they struck at the heart of certainty. Some Americans struggled with this intimacy. Regulations discouraged fraternization, and camp commanders reminded staff that kindness must not slip into friendship. Yet the lines blurred. A nurse in Alabama admitted, "We were warned not to smile too much. But how not to when one boy thanked me as if I'd given him his life back?" For the Germans, such moments carved deep fissures in ideology. They had been told Americans were soulless materialists, incapable of true culture or feeling. Yet here was a nurse humming Brahms as she changed a dressing. Here was a guard who slipped them sheet music for a choir. Here were words of comfort spoken in halting German by someone who had no reason to care. The paradox was unavoidable. Enemies spoke in the language of mercy, not hatred. In letters, songs, and whispered words at bedsides, Germans found traces of humanity where propaganda had promised only brutality. But mercy was not universally welcomed. Among die-hard Nazis in the camps, suspicion hardened into defiance. They accused fellow prisoners of weakness, mocked those who softened toward American kindness, and sometimes punished them in secret. The stage was set for the next clash, not between guns, but between loyalty to ideology and the shattering weight of lived reality. By 1944, the camps were not only holding pens but ideological battlegrounds. Within the barbed wire, German soldiers wrestled with a paradox far sharper than hunger or injury: how to reconcile their training, steeped in Nazi dogma, with the kindness they now encountered daily from American nurses, guards, and civilians. The Reich had promised them an enemy without humanity, yet reality delivered women who tended wounds with patience, cooks who filled their plates with beef and butter, chaplains who spoke of forgiveness, and even guards who shared cigarettes after long shifts. For some prisoners, this cracked the facade of belief. For others, it triggered a furious doubling down. The numbers revealed the struggle of the nearly 380,000 German POWs in the United States. Army intelligence estimated that perhaps 10–15% were ardent Nazis, men still fanatically loyal to Hitler. These men often held sway over their peers, forming clandestine groups inside the camps. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a suspected informant who spoke too positively of American treatment was murdered by fellow prisoners. His killers were later tried and hanged. It was a chilling reminder that ideology could cling with violence even inside America's abundance. The paradox was bitterly felt in the hospital wards. A nurse from Camp Swift recalled, "Some spat on the floor when we approached, refusing medicine. They said they would rather die than take the hand of an American woman. But even those men, when fever climbed high enough, stopped resisting. Ideology faltered before the body's needs. Morphine dulled hatred as surely as it dulled pain." Others, though, began to speak of doubt. A young conscript from Hamburg wrote in his hidden notebook, "We were told America was chaos without order or culture. Yet here I see order in everything, even in kindness. Perhaps we were lied to." Another prisoner later testified in debriefings that hearing a nurse hum Bach as she changed his bandages did more to break my faith in the Reich than 1,000 bombs. The sensory world amplified these contradictions. The stern shouts of Nazi loyalists in the barracks, demanding discipline and obedience, contrasted with the quiet rhythm of nurses' footsteps at night, checking pulses under dim lamplight. The smell of sweat and fear clashed with the clean sting of antiseptic. Prisoners lived between two realities, one pulling them back into ideology, the other nudging them toward rethinking everything they believed. The US military monitored this tension closely. Camp reports noted spikes in ideological conflict after mail deliveries, when letters from starving families in Germany arrived alongside the rich meals served in American mess halls. Commanders documented whispers of disbelief. "My children eat cabbage water while I am given steak." Such dissonance was dangerous to Nazi control. Some prisoners reacted with anger. A sergeant at Camp McCain raged that the abundance was a deliberate plot. "They feed us fat so we forget the fatherland." He rallied others to boycott meals, but within days hunger broke the protest. The paradox held America's decadence was irresistible. For the nurses, this tension was palpable. One remembered the eyes of a patient who refused to thank her, staring with a hatred that bandages could not soften. "It was like healing a wolf," she wrote. "You wondered if once he had strength again he would bite, yet she treated him anyway." That fidelity to principle, not propaganda, was America's quiet weapon. Not all prisoners resisted. Some volunteered for work details, eager to prove their gratitude. Others quietly began to dream of staying in America after the war, enchanted by the very society they had been taught to despise. Oral histories decades later are filled with confessions. "It was in those hospitals that I first thought perhaps Germany is wrong." Still, the struggle was not over. Ideology did not collapse overnight. It lingered in whispered oaths, in clandestine punishments, in the pride that refused to bend even before mercy. Yet the fractures widened daily, each act of unexpected kindness prying open a space for doubt. The paradox was unmistakable. Brutality had failed to break them, but compassion succeeded where violence could not. And as the war dragged on, those fractures widened under the weight of official policies, press debates, and public scrutiny, because America's treatment of its enemies was not only a matter of conscience, but also of controversy. By late 1944, the presence of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners scattered across America was no longer just a military matter. It had become a national conversation. Camps sprawled across 46 states, from California's arid deserts to Maine's pine forests, and within their barbed wire fences, the paradox of kindness toward enemies sparked debates that reached from kitchen tables to the halls of Congress. Officially, US Army policy was unambiguous. POWs were to be treated in strict accordance with the Geneva Convention. They would receive equal food, adequate shelter, and proper medical care. Yet outside the wire, questions simmered. Why were captured Nazis eating beef while American civilians made do with ration stamps for meat and butter? Why did enemy soldiers receive penicillin when local pharmacies still rationed it for children? The statistics fed resentment. In 1944, the US government allotted POWs 3,500 calories per day, exactly the same as US soldiers, while civilians averaged just 2,900 on ration books. Newspapers occasionally printed these numbers, stoking outrage. A Texas editorial thundered, "Our boys bleed overseas while Hitler's boys feast in our backyard." The paradox of mercy was now a political controversy. Inside the camps, disputes spilled into courts. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, when prisoners murdered fellow captive Johannes Kunze for speaking too positively of American treatment, the US convened a military tribunal. 7 German POWs were sentenced to hang, the largest mass execution of prisoners on American soil since the Civil War. For camp nurses who had treated the same men only days before, It was a chilling reminder that ideology still had claws. One wrote in her journal, "I changed their bandages. Then they killed a comrade. How does one reconcile that?" And yet for every scandal, there were statistics of success. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, 90% of prisoners volunteered for labor details, harvesting cotton and cutting timber, often alongside civilian farmers who marveled at their discipline. Prisoners were paid 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, which many spent on chocolate, tobacco, or stationery for letters home. To their families in Germany, these stories of paid labor and plentiful food sounded like propaganda, but they were real. The controversies sometimes turned personal. In Iowa, a farmer's wife wrote to the local paper in fury that the POWs picking corn on her land had been given fresh milk, while her own children drank powdered. At the same time, other Americans wrote of surprise at German politeness, even gratitude, and quietly admitted that seeing them treated humanely seemed to soften hatred on both sides. The nurses found themselves at the heart of this storm. They had neither drafted policy nor chosen the rations, yet their daily work embodied the paradox. One Army nurse in Louisiana reflected years later, "People said we spoiled them. But when you wash the fever from a man's skin, you don't ask politics, you do your duty. And maybe that duty is stronger than hate." The sensory contrasts framed the debate. Outside the wire, civilians clutched ration books, queuing for gasoline or sugar. Inside, Germans clutched trays heavy with meatloaf and potatoes. Beyond the camp, heads healed by women who smiled. Either we were lied to, or the world is stranger than we knew. Oral histories decades later reveal the same astonishment. Prisoners spoke less of guard towers or barbed wire, and more of kindness. The nurse who pressed a cool cloth to a fevered brow, the orderly who shared his cigarette, the ice cream on a summer afternoon in Texas. One veteran admitted, "I went to America thinking of cowboys and gangsters. I left believing their greatest weapon was not the bomb but their mercy." Statistics anchor the legacy. Nearly 380,000 German POWs passed through US camps. Fewer than 3% attempted escape. The overwhelming majority returned home, not brutalized but bewildered, many with softened views of their captors. In post-war surveys, over half admitted their image of America had changed for the better. This was no accident. It was the product of a system that insisted, sometimes against public anger, on treating enemies with dignity. For the nurses, the memories were bittersweet. Some recalled the suspicion of their own neighbors who asked why they wasted compassion on Nazis. Others carried pride that they had upheld their oath without compromise. One Army nurse, interviewed in 1972, summarized, "We did not heal Nazis. We healed men, and in doing so we proved who we were." The sensory echoes endured: the sterile tang of carbolic soap, the clatter of trays heavy with food, the murmur of hymns in a language once feared. To many prisoners, those sounds and scents remained tied. Lines raged about shortages. Within the infirmary, antiseptic and clean linens marked a standard of care envied by many civilian hospitals. The gulf was real, and the American public felt it. But commanders held firm. General Brigham Somervell, head of Army Service Forces, defended the policy bluntly: "We will not starve prisoners, nor will we violate our treaties. We are Americans, and our conduct will remain American." His words captured the paradox at scale. Mercy was not weakness, but a demonstration of strength, an assertion that America could afford generosity even to its enemies. By war's end, more than 2,000 POW camps dotted the United States, housing nearly 380,000 Germans and 50,000 Italians, most left with bellies fuller than they had known in years, memories of kindness from strangers, and questions that gnawed at their loyalty to Hitler. But their story did not end with the lowering of the Reich's flag. As the war closed and prisoners boarded ships homeward, they carried more than rations and memories. They carried a paradox that would echo for decades. They had come as conquerors, been captured as enemies, and left as reluctant students of an America they barely understood. By the spring of 1946, the tide had turned fully. The Reich lay in ruins. Hitler was dead, and the camps across America began emptying as shiploads of German POWs boarded transports eastward. The clang of gates and the rumble of trains once again marked their passage. But now the journey pointed toward a homeland they no longer recognized. The paradox followed them. Many had left families who starved on rations of 1,200 calories a day, only to return with bellies softened by American abundance. Some carried snapshots of camp choirs. Others a dictionary gifted by a nurse. Still others only the indelible memory of white-clad figures who had treated them without hatred. A former Luftwaffe mechanic told his village on return, "We were fed meat every day. We were healed by women who smiled." American treatment shaped post-war ties. Former prisoners often became unlikely ambassadors, telling their communities that America was not the barbaric monster painted by Goebbels, but a land of baffling generosity. Some emigrated back, marrying women they met during captivity, starting farms in the Midwest, or working in factories where their hands no longer built weapons. The paradox rippled outward. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. They expected brutality. They found compassion. They imagined starvation. They left with the taste of ice cream and the memory of nurses who spoke to them like human beings. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, planes, or tanks. It was its abundance, and its refusal to let hatred define its conduct.